Hey everyone, Sebastian here. Just a reminder that the Intelligent Speech Conference is just days away. Get yourself a ticket and join us on November 4th online to hear talks from all your favorite history podcasters, including yours truly. Just go to intelligentspeechonline.com now and enter promo code FAKE to get 10% off your ticket. See you on November 4th. In 1978, the sheriff of Essex County, Massachusetts, was forced to take an early retirement. Robert E. Cahill had held the post of sheriff for just 4 years before he was stricken by a heart attack and a stroke, both brought on by a rare blood condition that puzzled his doctors. Cahill survived the ordeal, but he became convinced that his ailment may have had a supernatural explanation. You see, Robert Cahill was not the first Essex County sheriff to retire under strange medical circumstances. According to Cahill, the sheriff before him had also, quote, contracted a serious blood ailment while in office that forced him to retire. That sheriff, in turn, had inherited the post from his father after the elder man died of a heart attack while serving as sheriff. The previous sheriff had suffered heart problems as well. End quote. This sent Cahill on a hunt through the archives, and what he discovered was that every man who had held the position of sheriff in Essex County from 1692 to 1991 had either died in office or had been forced to vacate the position because of a heart attack, stroke, or some other, quote, ailment of the blood, end quote. In other words, for 300 years, the office of sheriff had been cursed. You see, Essex is the county that's home to Salem, Massachusetts. And for 300 years, the sheriff's office and the local jail was located in Salem. In 1991, a new prison was built in nearby Middleton, Massachusetts, and the sheriff's office was moved into that facility. According to Cahill, this relocation finally broke the curse. Now, it's worth noting that our narrator here may have some reason to exaggerate. After retiring as the sheriff of Essex County, Cahill went on to have a fairly successful career as an author, penning compendiums of New England lore and spooky stories. That's not to say that Cahill is lying to us. I just want to point out that he was the kind of guy that liked a good story. He recounted the tale of this strange happening in a book titled Cursed New England. So, take that for what it is. But Robert Cahill was not the first person to note the curse on the Essex County Sheriff's Office. That curse was said to have stemmed from the terrible death of one of the most famous victims of the Salem witch trials. This was a man named Giles Corey, and his ghost is still said to haunt the grounds of what was once called Salem Village. It's believed that Corey cursed the blood of every man to hold the position of sheriff, and it's said that his apparition has appeared in the Salem Village graveyard on the eve of every disaster that has befallen the town. Fires, floods, and destructive storms were always presaged by the ghoulish appearance of Giles Corey's vengeful shade. Or at least, so go the stories. While I can't speak to the veracity of the tales of Corey's ghost, I can confirm that Giles Corey was a real person. His dramatic and gruesome death has been remembered as a symbol of the violent excesses of the 1692 witch panic. So, what went down? Well, in 1692, Giles Corey was still a vital man at the age of 81 years old. He was a fairly prosperous farmer in Salem Village, but he had a reputation for being stubborn, prickly, and hot-tempered. Over the course of his life, he had had a few run-ins with the law. As a younger man, he had been booked more than once for petty theft. Court records also show that while he was serving in the colonial militia, he once fell asleep on a watch and, embarrassingly, had his weapon stolen from his hands. Years later, Giles Corey was found guilty of using quote-unquote unreasonable force after he beat one of his indentured servants to death after he caught the man stealing apples. In the 1600s in New England, the punishment for beating this kind of servant to death was just a stiff fine. All this is to say that Giles Corey was not a perfect man. In fact, he does not seem to have been a good man. But he wasn't a wizard. Corey was first swept up in the witch crisis when his wife, Martha Corey, was accused of witchcraft in early March of 1692. This came during the flurry of accusations in the weeks that followed the bombshell confession of Samuel Parris's Barbadian slave, Tituba. Roughly a month later, as accused people started confessing and naming more and more people allegedly part of the vast Satanic conspiracy, Giles Corey was accused of practicing black magic along with his wife. But Giles Corey was not about to go quietly. In an act of characteristic defiance, he denied all charges and then refused to enter a formal plea in front of the court. According to the English legal tradition on which this court was based, the trial could not proceed until the accused person entered a plea. So Corey was jailed and sat waiting 6 months before he was officially arraigned before the specially convened court that was hearing the witchcraft cases in Salem. When Giles Corey was finally brought before this court in September of 1692, he once again refused to enter a plea. Annoyed by this act of defiance, the court decided to employ a very old, rarely used method of extracting a plea from an uncompliant accused person. This was known in the Old French as peine forte et dure, but it was more commonly known in English as pressing the prisoner. The technique involved stripping the accused person naked, laying them on the ground, placing flat wooden boards on top of them, and then steadily piling heavy rocks on top of the boards, slowly crushing the person until they relented and entered a plea. That is exactly what was done to Giles Corey. The pressing was overseen by the High Sheriff of Essex County, one George Corwin. In an empty field in Salem Village, Giles Corey was steadily pressed by an ever-increasing load of rocks for over 2 solid days before he was finally crushed to death. Throughout the whole ordeal, he steadfastly refused to enter a plea and end the torture. Now, there are differing traditions when it comes to Giles Corey's last words. One tradition has it that Corey looked hard at Sheriff Corwin and exclaimed, quote, "Damn you! I curse you and Salem," end quote, pronouncing the curse that would haunt the sheriff's office for the next 300 years. However, I personally prefer the tradition that tells us that in his final moments, Giles Corey stoically demanded, quote, "more weight," before his lungs collapsed. Some sources say that the demand for more weight may have actually been a plea for mercy. More weight may have meant, kill me now, put me out of my misery. If I have to choose a myth, then I choose the stoic, badass Giles Corey asking to die rather than participate in what had become a charade of justice. The real Giles Corey may not have been a good man, but there's something to be said about dying with style. Sources usually add the grisly detail that in Corey's final moments, the weight forced his tongue out of his mouth. Seeing this, the unsympathetic Sheriff Corwin forced it back in with his cane. The death of Giles Corey is sometimes noted as a turning point in the Salem witch trials. His very public torture at the hands of the authorities had the air of martyrdom about it. Corey's refusal to enter a plea was interpreted by some as a protest against the legitimacy of a court that was handing out execution orders based on little more than stories about specters and apparitions. In the Hollywood version of events, the pressing of Giles Corey would act as a grisly wake-up call that things had gone too far. The sacrifice would serve to redeem the community and give them a new clarity of perception. But real history is rarely that clean. While this was certainly remembered as an excess that perhaps started moving public opinion towards ending the witch trials, Giles Corey's pressing did not immediately change anything. The largest group of executions was still to come. A few weeks later, the court would go into a recess from which it would never return, but it would be deep in the spring of 1693 before all the legal proceedings associated with witchcraft in Salem had finally been concluded. How had it gotten to this point? How was it that the strange behavior of 4 young girls had started a series of events that resulted in Giles Corey's public torture, not to mention the execution of 19 individuals and the death of 5 more in prison? Those girls had originally accused 3 local women of using black magic to torment them, but by October of 1692, nearly 200 people, many of whom did not live in Salem, were accused of being part of a massive satanic plot. In the summer and fall of 1692, it seemed like every day new people were being named as witches. Many of those accused were confessing, and in the process revealing still more names. Accusations bred more accusations. It had a momentum all its own. You might assume that it would be a long road from a little girl barking like a dog to mass hangings and a fatally crushed Giles Corey. But in Salem, it all played out in less than a year. Can a crisis be logically understood once it hits its terrifying peak? Let's see what we can do today on Our Fake History. Episode number 189, What Bewitched Salem, Part 3. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I need to remind everyone listening that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and start supporting at $5 every month to get access to an ad-free feed and a buttload of Patreon-only extra episodes. You'll even hear your name at the end of the show. A reminder to all my patrons that the polls are still open to vote on the topic for the next extra episode. Right now, Merlin the Wizard and the Nazca lines of Peru are in a tight race, but still, more than 50% of you have not voted. Let's be a functioning democracy, people. Let your voice be known. You can find the poll pinned to the top of the Patreon page. If you want to get in on all of this and get access to that extra episode when I eventually produce it, Then head over to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and choose the level of support that works for you. I also want to remind everyone that new shirt designs are now available at the TeePublic store. We are creeping towards gift-giving season, and what could be better for the OFH fan in your life than an Our Fake History t-shirt, hoodie, coffee mug, or just a sticker to slap on your guitar case. The new designs are super cool. They were taken from your favorite images from the Season 8 episode artwork. And as always, everything was created by the OFH artist-in-residence, Frank Fiorentino. Grabbing some merch not only supports OFH, it also supports Frank. So, go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links to the TeePublic store. You'll love it. This week, we are concluding our trilogy on the Salem witchcraft crisis of 1692. This is part 3 of 3. So if you have not heard the first 2 parts, then I strongly suggest that you go back and give them a listen now. In part 1, I spent some time exploring the history of witch hunting to better put the events of 1692 in context. One of the key ideas that I wanted to underscore was the observation that many scholars have made that witchcraft panics tend to accompany moments of societal stress brought on by things that are not witches. Famine, war, disease, and political turmoil have consistently been the precursors to large-scale witch hunts throughout history. Societies tend to get more sensitive about witchcraft when they're already stressed and people are anxious about the future. I then went on to detail all the ways that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was in a particularly anxious state when the witchcraft panic broke out in 1692. The political future of the colony was uncertain. The coldest years of the Little Ice Age had been unkind to a series of harvests, and an ongoing war with the French and the indigenous Wabanaki Confederacy had many fearing an attack at any minute. In part 2, we look closely at the first few accusations of witchcraft that kicked off the Salem Panic. This meant debunking some myths that have grown up around an enslaved woman known as Tituba. I did my best to throw some cold water on the idea that Tituba led the afflicted girls in dances and practiced some misunderstood Caribbean folk magic in the home of Salem's minister, the Reverend Samuel Parris. There's really no good historical evidence to support those assumptions. With that said, it does seem that Tituba's bombshell confession of witchcraft in the early stages of the trials may have been the essential ingredient that transformed this from an isolated witch hunt into a colony-consuming witch panic. In the last episode, I also brought up the possibility that some of the afflicted girls' strange behavior can possibly be explained as a mass psychogenic illness. That is a strange quirk of group psychology where one person's anxiety-induced ailment can become contagious. But of course, that's not the only possible explanation for what was going on. One theory that I didn't get a chance to touch on in the last episode was the idea that the girls' strange behavior was brought on by ergot poisoning. Yes, ergot has once again returned to the podcast. Longtime listeners might remember that ergot mold is a parasitic fungus that can grow on cereal grains like rye. When ingested, ergot can act as a hallucinogen. Bread made from ergot-tainted rye could potentially create a situation where multiple people experienced a mania brought on by the hallucinogenic mold. Given their size, children would have been especially susceptible to the effects of ingested ergot. This theory was first proposed by the historian Linda Carporial in a 1976 article titled "Ergotism, the Satan Loosed in Salem." This article was part of a larger trend at the time that was seriously considering ergot as an explanation for a number of otherwise hard-to-explain historical events.
Ergotism has been proposed as a potential explanation for the strange European dancing plagues, which broke out in the late medieval and early modern periods. Longtime listeners might also remember that the visions of Joan of Arc have been explained as ergot-inspired hallucinations.
But in all of these cases, ergot poisoning is never a fully satisfying explanation for the phenomenon. I would argue that the same is true in the Salem case. In the case of Salem, the staggered onset of the strange behaviors in the girls hurts the ergot theory. Betty Paris was first afflicted in December of 1691. Abigail Williams, her cousin, wasn't afflicted until a few weeks later. Ann Putnam Jr. and Elizabeth Hubbard did not show their first signs of affliction until late February of 1692. The other afflicted girls and young women wouldn't start claiming that they were being tormented until around mid-March 1692. Were they all eating infected bread at different times, months apart? Maybe, but it doesn't seem super likely. Also, consider that these strange behaviors lasted for months. If ergot was behind this, then that would mean that the girls were getting dosed again and again over months. Now, that's not impossible. Maybe there was a lot of ergot-infested bread going around, but it's not super likely. If there was that much infected bread in the community, then you might expect to see even more symptoms of ergotism spread out among a greater cross-section of the local population. Even Corporeal admitted in her article that ergot alone cannot explain the entire Salem witch panic. These days, most experts have moved away from the ergot theory. In my time researching this podcast, I've personally become pretty disillusioned with ergot. Anytime I'm looking into some weird historical event, there's always one expert who suggests that funky little mold was behind everything. And it never provides a good explanation. Sorry, ergot, you ain't it. All right. With that addressed, I think we should jump back into the timeline of events in Salem and see how the first round of accusations metastasized into a deadly series of witch trials. If there's one theme that I've been returning to again and again in this series, it's that the Salem witch trials resist a simple explanation. There were too many things going on simultaneously in Salem in 1692 that contributed to the crisis for any one to be singled out as the main cause. As we discussed in part 1 of this series, when the witchcraft crisis first broke out, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was on the precipice of a massive constitutional change. In 1691, representatives from the colony had traveled to England to negotiate a new charter for Massachusetts to replace the much maligned charter for the Dominion of New England that had been thrown out along with Governor Andros after the Boston Revolt of 1689. This new charter would also replace the 1629 charter that had been much beloved by the Puritans. In 1691, something new was created with the input from notable Puritan colonists. It didn't guarantee the kind of theocracy some Puritans would have preferred, but it was generally considered an improvement over the charter from the Andros years. It was a compromise. When this new charter was approved, it effectively nullified the old legal system that had been in place in Massachusetts. New courts could not be set up and would not start functioning until the new governor, William Phips, with the new charter in hand, got back to the colony from England and was officially sworn in. So, that meant from October 1691 until May of 1692, no trials for capital crimes, like witchcraft, could be held in Massachusetts. There could be arrests, there could be pre-trial hearings, people could be jailed, but no one could be properly tried. Sure enough, right in the middle of this no court window is when the Salem witchcraft crisis broke out. The timing could not have been worse. It could be argued that one of the reasons that the Salem situation was able to develop into a full-scale crisis was because the accused people could not be properly tried for months after their arrest. When William Phips was sworn in as governor of the newly renamed province of Massachusetts Bay on May 14, 1692, he walked into a situation where 40 people in Salem were accused of witchcraft and were in jail awaiting trial. On the day of his swearing in, 8 more people were accused and arrested for witchcraft. Phips had got off the boat in Boston and found his colony in the midst of a growing crisis. I can't help but think of that meme from the TV show Community. You know, the one where Donald Glover walks into a room with a pizza box and a big smile on his face, and in the next panel you see that the room's on fire and people are going crazy? Well, William Phips is Donald Glover and the tasty pizza is the Charter of 1691. If one of you out there could mock this up, I would appreciate that. Send it to the Facebook page or hit me up on Instagram. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, whoa, Sebastian, when we left off, there were only 3 women accused of witchcraft. How did we get to 48 people? Great question. Let's rewind a little. When we left off in Salem, it was March 2nd, 1692, and Tituba had just finished her astounding confession. You might remember that she claimed that she'd been forced to take part in a witches' Sabbath with 5 other witches, and 4 people she described as quote-unquote possessed women. She identified 2 of those witches as the 2 other women who had been accused along with her, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. But what was truly worrying was that Tituba's testimony suggested that there were a number of yet-to-be-identified witches still at large in the colony. With no way to properly try these 3 accused witches, all the people of Salem could do was throw them in jail, wait for the governor to arrive in Massachusetts, and anxiously stew on the implications of Tituba's testimony. At first, the jailing of the 3 accused witches seemed to help the symptoms of the afflicted girls. For a short time, the alleged torments stopped. But soon, one of the girls started complaining that she was being tormented again. The girl was Ann Putnam Jr., who you might remember was a friend to the original afflicted girls, and the daughter of Thomas Putnam, an influential local farmer who was deep in the factional conflicts that had been tearing Salem apart. Well, in mid-March, after the jailing of the first 3 accused witches, Anne started claiming that she was now being visited by the malicious spirit of Dorcas Good, the daughter of the accused witch, Sarah Good. This accusation was perhaps expected, given that Sarah Good was already guilty in the court of public opinion. But this one feels especially tragic, given that little Dorcas was only about 4 years old at the time. While the accusation of Dorcas Good was certainly sad, the two other accusations made by Ann Putnam Jr. really raised some eyebrows. She claimed that along with little Dorcas, she was also being tormented by the specters of Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse. This marked yet another turning point in this crisis, because both of these women were respected, pious churchgoers. These were not the kinds of people who were usually accused of witchcraft. Rebecca Nurse was from a very prominent family in Salem. She had a sterling reputation and was known for her acts of piety. This was a rich, well-connected woman who had never sniffed a controversy. So, what was happening here? Well, either Ann Putnam truly believed that the ghostly apparition of Rebecca Nurse was tormenting her, or the Putnam family was using this crisis to go after the Nurse family, a rival in Salem's ugly factional disputes. You might remember that the Putnams were the de facto leaders of the economically declining Salem Village faction. The Nurse family were a prosperous group more aligned with Salem town. Notably, Rebecca Nurse was a member of the Salem Town Church and not the Salem Village congregation. You might remember from the last episode that the accusation of Sarah Osborne also coincidentally helped the interests of Thomas Putnam, who is in the midst of a civil suit with the woman. Now, it's hard to prove this, but many historians, including the influential researchers Paul Boyer and Stephen Niesenbaum, have proposed that Thomas Putnam may have been using his daughter to settle scores with his enemies in the community. Martha Corey, wife of the soon-to-be-accused Giles Corey, who we spoke about in the introduction, wasn't as clearly aligned with any of the local factions. But she had become an early critic of the witch hunt. She had been heard publicly questioning the testimony of the afflicted girls. That may have been why she was accused. Indeed, as the crisis progressed, many people who publicly questioned the reliability of the so-called afflicted girls or the operations of the trials found themselves accused of witchcraft. This second round of accusations confirmed that these afflicted girls had quite a lot of power in Salem. These girls only needed to speak someone's name, and the authorities felt compelled to arrest and question them, even if that person was a respected churchgoer like Rebecca Nurse. I think this second set of accusations is worth noting because it demonstrated the true power of the afflicted to the community. And after that power was demonstrated, you see a whole new crop of young women who claimed to be afflicted themselves. Many of these young women were older than the original group of afflicted girls, most being in their late teens. By early April, Salem teens Mercy Lewis, Mary Warren, Elizabeth Booth, Susanna Sheldon, and Mary Walcott were also naming names of people in the community whose spirits were allegedly tormenting them. They were soon joined by a group of adult married women, among them Ann Putnam's mother, known as Ann Putnam Sr., along with Sarah Bibber, Gertrude Pope, and Elizabeth Churchill. Now, don't worry about remembering all those names. I know it can be a lot. I just wanted to make the point. that around a month after Tituba's original testimony, the accusers went from being 4 girls between the ages of 9 and 14 to 12 young women, some of whom were adults. With more accusers, of course, came more accusations. Each of the newly afflicted women would affirm that they too were being tormented by one of the already named witches. And then they would usually accuse someone new. By mid-April, over a dozen people were accused of witchcraft in Salem. And by the end of May, over 40 people were accused. Now, were these young women also suffering from the mass psychogenic illness that potentially affected Betty Paris and her cousin? It's possible. But I think a critical observer needs to be especially suspicious of this second group of afflicted girls. Among them, there were almost certainly some who were faking their afflictions. Why pretend to be bewitched? In a society where women had very little power, especially unmarried teen girls, an opportunity to wield an enormous amount of power had suddenly presented itself. Some may have been attracted to that. Others may have been encouraged by family members, seeing a route to local influence. Again, this is hard to prove, but it's worth considering. I also find it interesting that by June of 1692, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, the girls who started everything, stopped participating in the trials. Both girls were sent away from Salem to live with friends or relatives, and we're told they quickly recovered from the symptoms of bewitchment once they were separated from the other afflicted girls. So, during the most deadly phase of the witch trials, Betty and Abigail, the girls that the community was ostensibly trying to protect in the first place, were out of the picture and had fully recovered. Instead, a new group of mostly older girls were the ones in court making accusations. One particular individual who was almost certainly faking her afflictions was 19-year-old Mary Warren. Mary had been a servant in the house of Elizabeth and John Proctor, two local farmers who you might remember came up earlier in this series. Now, sometime around late March 1692, Mary started claiming that she was being poked by invisible hands and tormented by specters conjured by local witches. But her boss, John Proctor, was having none of this. John Proctor was another vocal skeptic of the witch hunt, who believed that all these girls were either faking their afflictions or were somehow deluded. So he told Mary that if she didn't cut it out with this talk of being bewitched, he would beat her. Not long after that, Mary's fits seemed to stop. She was so relieved by this that she wrote a note and tacked it to the Salem meeting house door, asking for prayers in thanks for this development. Please thank God for curing me from my affliction. The Reverend Samuel Paris read this note and got suspicious. What did this girl mean that she'd been afflicted and then got better? The other girls weren't getting better. What was different here? So the Reverend questioned Mary Warren, and in the course of that questioning, she made the fateful statement that, quote, "the afflicted persons did but dissemble," end quote. Now, there's some debate around what she exactly meant by that, but it was interpreted that she was saying that the afflicted girls were lying. It wasn't long before it became public knowledge that Mary Warren thought that the afflicted girls were all fakers. And what do you know? By mid-April, as the accusations were mounting, a number of the afflicted girls claimed that the specter of Mary Warren was now tormenting them. When she finally had a chance to face her accusers in a pretrial hearing, the afflicted girls once again reacted in a way that had become very common at these hearings. When the accused person took the stand, if they denied the charges, the girls would sometimes start screaming or having fits. Some would fall to the floor. Others would claim that they saw demonic creatures circling around the accused person. Or they would claim that the person on the stand was using their specter at that moment to torment them. These wild outbursts were usually interpreted as evidence that the person on stand truly was a witch. When Mary Warren took the stand on April 18th, the afflicted once again started having fits. But what made Mary Warren's testimony unique is that she started having a fit right back at them. She too was being tormented by satanic specters, or so she claimed. It was a scene that no one really knew how to interpret. After this bizarre hearing, Mary Warren was taken to jail, where she stayed for a number of weeks before making a confession. She eventually told the authorities that the afflicted girls weren't lying. Their torments were real, and she had participated in them. But she'd been forced to sign the Devil's Book and participate in witchcraft by her employers, Elizabeth and John Proctor. Further, their malicious specters continued to assault her. By the time Mary Warren made that confession, both Elizabeth and John Proctor, two noted witch trial skeptics, had already been accused of witchcraft by other members of the community. Her confession fit perfectly. This confession and sincere repentance was convincing enough that Mary Warren was released from jail. She then joined the ranks of the afflicted girls, and over the next 2 months, she became one of the most tenacious accusers in Salem. She would end up providing the court with the names of all sorts of witches, and her testimony would contribute to a number of people going to the gallows. Now, it seems fairly obvious that Mary Warren made a conscious decision while in jail that she would rather be an accuser than one of the accused. Or at least, that's how it seems to me. The cases of the Coreys, the Proctors, and Mary Warren demonstrate fairly clearly that one of the most dangerous things one could do after March of 1692 in Salem was question the sincerity of the afflicted people. Governor William Phips was finally sworn in as governor on May 14, 1692, at which point the Salem situation had been allowed to fester for months without any proper legal proceedings. One of his first orders of business was to convene a special court that could start hearing these witchcraft cases. To do this, he created something known as a court of oyer and terminer. This was an Old English legal institution whose name was an anglicization of the Old Norman French words for to hear and decide, oyer et terminer. In fact, in the American Supreme Court, proceedings still begin with a chant of oyez, oyez, oyez. That comes from this. Let's hear, let's hear, let's hear. Anyway, the Charter of 1691 meant that legislators in Massachusetts had to begin a long process of setting up new permanent courts for the colony. The Court of Oyer and Terminer could be convened quickly and could start hearing cases even before those new courts were properly functioning. Finally, on June 2nd, 1692, the Court of Oyer and Terminer convened for the first time in Salem town.
After 3 months of accusations, arrests, and chaotic pretrial hearings, the formal prosecutions in the Salem witch trials could finally begin.
So let's pause here, and when we return, we'll see if anything changed in Salem once a proper court was in session. If you thought that the convening of the Court of Oyer and Terminer might have reined in the growing witchcraft panic in Massachusetts, well, my friends, you would be wrong. By the time the court convened in June of 1692, the situation was already completely out of control. The court could have potentially calmed the situation if, say, it had insisted on a certain quality of evidence, or had barred the afflicted from interrupting testimony with their outbursts. But the court did not do that. Instead, the Court of Oyer and Terminer lent a new legitimacy to the theatrics that had characterized the hearings in Salem up to that point. First, in a controversial move that was the source of much discussion amongst the legal minds of Massachusetts at the time, the court allowed and took seriously what was called spectral evidence. This was testimony from afflicted people about being harassed by ghostly apparitions or specters in the shape of one of the accused witches. In the vast majority of the cases that were brought before the Court of Oyer and Terminer, the only evidence produced against the witnesses was spectral evidence. A witness would say that they saw a witch's ghost, and that ghost was messing with them. The court also continued the practice that had come out of the pretrial hearings of using the afflicted girls as a way to provide evidence of witchcraft in real time at the trial. During the testimony of an accused person, the afflicted would react to whatever was being said. As I already mentioned, these reactions included wild fits, fainting spells, and screams that the girls were seeing ghostly apparitions at that moment. The Court of Oyer and Terminer also allowed something known as the touch test to be used during the examination of the accused. This involved an accused witch touching an afflicted person who was having a fit. If the afflicted person calmed down when they were touched, this was considered evidence that the person who had touched them was the witch behind the torments. Now, just before, I used the term theatrics to describe these displays, which I understand is a loaded term. It obviously suggests that the girls were faking. And to be clear, we don't know that all of the girls were faking their reactions in the courtroom. Some of them may have been swept up in the energy of the moment, or perhaps they were being affected by a mass psychogenic illness. Others may have started faking something and then really started to believe it, which is another weird thing that can happen. The first person to be tried by the Court of Oyer and Terminer was a woman named Bridget Bishop. Now, I haven't had a chance to mention her yet, as she was accused during the rash of accusations that happened in mid-April 1692. Now, it's notable that the court decided to adjudicate her case first, considering that she was not even close to the first person accused. But it seems likely that the prosecutor chose to put Bridget Bishop first on the docket because she was one of the only people accused for whom there was some physical evidence that she may have practiced a form of folk magic. Bishop was a tavern owner from Salem town who had a reputation for being a touch rebellious. She dressed in a way that the Puritans found kinda weird. Don't think overtly sexy or anything. Think funky. The sources tell us that her clothes were unusually hemmed. She was an individual. She also had the bad fortune of being accused of witchcraft a few years earlier, although she was acquitted at that time. In other words, Bridget Bishop was one of the usual witchy suspects in Salem. In April, 5 of the afflicted girls had claimed that the specter of Bridget Bishop was amongst their growing list of tormentors. The testimony of the afflicted was, of course, a big part of the trial. But the other key piece of evidence was the testimony of 2 workmen who had done some renovations on Bridget Bishop's home a few years previously. They testified that when doing that work, they had found 2 rag dolls in the home known as poppets. Poppets were commonly used in English folk magic in the way we think of voodoo dolls. A little rag doll would be made, and then it might be burned or pins might be stuck through it in the hopes of doing harm to an enemy. Now, it's worth noting that these poppets were never produced in court, but the testimony that the workmen had seen them was considered fairly damning. Now, in the vast majority of the cases that would come before the court, the only evidence was spectral evidence. In the case of Bridget Bishop, there was at least some evidence that she dabbled in darker forms of folk magic. And not even much evidence, I'll add, but some. She was found guilty on January 10th, 1692. She became the first person executed as the result of the Salem witch trials. And no, she was not burnt at the stake. This is one of the classic myths about the Salem witch trials. The convicted witches were not burnt, they were hanged by the neck. Burnings were only common in continental Europe. English witches were almost always hanged, and the English colonies in America followed that custom. But as a quick aside, this to me is an example of a very boring historical myth. This is the stuff that poorly researched internet listicles tell you. Google biggest historical myths and you'll quickly learn that the witches at Salem were hanged and not burned. But come on, in an event this weird, the big misconception is that witches were hanged and not burned. Man, talk about burying the lead. That's why you got to listen to this show. You know we go deep. Anyway, after the execution of Bridget Bishop, the court took a 20-day recess to get advice from Massachusetts' great legal minds and faith leaders on whether or not they were proceeding in the right way. A letter representing the views of many influential ministers was composed by a man named Cotton Mather. Mather was from one of the most august Puritan families in Massachusetts. Both he and his father, Increase Mather, were very famous, very respected, and their advice carried a lot of weight. And you gotta love those names, too. Cotton and Increase Mather. Love that. Anyway, Cotton Mather's letter advised caution when it came to convicting people based on spectral evidence. He also said that the court should be skeptical of an accusation when the person accused had a quote-unquote unblemished character. But he also made it clear that he believed that witches were out there harming the good people of Massachusetts. He concluded the letter by advocating for the, quote, speedy and vigorous prosecution of such as have rendered themselves obnoxious, end quote. The effect was that Mather's advice to proceed with caution was drowned out by his call to prosecute some witches. So, when the court reconvened, they went about their business with a new vigor, believing that they had the blessing of the colony's most influential ministers. Starting June 30th, the court reconvened and began proceedings against 5 accused women, among them Sarah Good, one of the original accused witches, and Rebecca Nurse, the first well-to-do Salem witch. All 5 women were found guilty, being convicted almost solely on the basis of spectral evidence and the reactions of the afflicted girls while they were on the stand. These 5 women were executed on what would become known as Gallows Hill on July 19th. Now, when you heard Sarah Good's name there, you may have been wondering what happened to those other 2 women who were accused at the outset, Tituba and Sarah Osborne. Sadly, Sarah Osborne became the first casualty of the witch hunt back in May. She had been old and sick at the time of her arrest and did not last long in the squalor of the Salem jail. Tituba was not being tried because she had confessed and was now working as a witness for the prosecution. This was another quirk of the Salem witch trials that helps explain exactly why they got so out of control. Normally, a confessed witch would be tried. The witch would plead guilty and would sometimes still be executed. However, a sincere confession could sometimes save a person from the gallows. In the case of Salem, many noticed that the confessed witches weren't even going to trial. The court was first concerning themselves with accused people who insisted on their innocence.
Now, if these trials had continued indefinitely, it's possible that these confessed witches would have been tried and sentenced by the court.
But when the witch trials finally wrapped up, not a single confessed witch was officially convicted or sentenced. In practice, this meant that if you were accused, there was a real advantage in confessing and naming names. When the court started executing people, confessions became way more common. I mean, there's nothing like an execution to give people a real sense of the stakes. This is when the accusations became way more chaotic. As I've hopefully been demonstrating, there were essentially 3 categories of accusations during the Salem witch trials. First, there were the usual suspects, people in the community who had been flagged as potential witches for years. Sarah Good and Bridget Bishop fell into that category. Then there were the people on the wrong side of the influential Putnam family. Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Osborne, and Giles and Martha Corey would be examples of that. And then finally, there were a ton of people that didn't fall into either category. Many of these more random accusations came from the confessed witches. This meant that as the witch trials kept going, more and more people from outside of Salem started being accused. Both the afflicted girls and the newly confessed witches started naming people from neighboring communities like Andover, Marblehead, and some from as far away as Boston. After all, why should this vast satanic conspiracy only be limited to Salem? And indeed, when the accusations left the boundaries of Salem Village and Salem Town, that's when the crisis truly became colony-wide. It no longer seemed to matter where you lived. It started to seem that if someone from Salem knew your name, there was a chance that you could be accused of witchcraft. By far, the most significant out-of-towner to be accused of witchcraft in Salem was the Reverend George Burroughs. Now, as much as Reverend Burroughs was living in faraway Wells, Maine at the time that he was accused of sending his specter to torment the afflicted girls, he was no stranger to the people of Salem. George Burroughs had served as the pastor of Salem Village Church for a tumultuous 2 years between 1680 and 1682. He had quit the position and moved to Maine after the townsfolk stopped paying him, which, as you might remember, was a recurring issue for the pastors of Salem Village. Before he left Salem, his wife tragically passed away, and Burroughs was forced to borrow money to pay for her funeral expenses. This money was borrowed from John Putnam. Of course, the aforementioned Putnam family that was right at the heart of the witch hunt. Burroughs had been unable to pay Putnam back, and he left Salem with the understanding that the church would eventually cover the outstanding debt. This didn't sit well with John Putnam, who had George Burroughs arrested in 1683 over the matter of the unpaid debt. Luckily for Reverend Burroughs, a handful of community members who didn't want to see him thrown in jail chipped in and settled his debts with John Putnam. Now, even though this had all gone down 9 years earlier, it seems relevant to bring up because there was some bad blood between George Burroughs and the Putnam family. There were also a handful of unusual stories about the Reverend that had circulated around Salem. For someone who had a very public-facing job, he was known for being intensely private. There was a rumor that his house in Salem Village was haunted. There was also a rumor that he possessed a kind of superhuman strength, perhaps gifted to him by the devil. Many villagers had heard that he could pick up a musket by just sticking his finger in the muzzle, which I guess is a thing regular folks can't do. There was also a story that he once carried a heavy barrel of molasses by sticking one finger in a hole in the barrel. So, I don't know, this one finger trick really blew people's minds. It was also known that George Burroughs had been one of the few survivors of a Wabanaki raid in Falmouth, Maine, that essentially destroyed the settlement. When Burroughs moved to Salem a few years after that attack, he brought with him a fellow survivor, a young servant girl named Mercy Lewis. Flash forward to 1692, Mercy Lewis was now one of the accusing afflicted girls. I bring this up because one of the theories that has been suggested by historian James E. Kenses for the spread of the witchcraft panic is something he called invasion neurosis. He's argued that the widespread fear of attack by the Wabanaki, especially among people like Mercy Lewis, who had previously survived attacks or who had had family members who'd been killed, manifested as a paranoia about witches. The fact that George Burroughs had miraculously survived a famously brutal Wabanaki raid may have marked him as suspicious by those suffering from invasion neurosis. Or so goes the theory. Either way, the Reverend was accused by the afflicted girls in late April 1692. This meant that Massachusetts lawmen had to travel all the way to Maine to arrest George Burroughs. But they managed to find him. They hauled him back to Salem and held him in jail until his trial in August of 1692. Burroughs' trial was the best attended of all the Salem witch trials. Since Burroughs was a Puritan minister, the accusation that he was a secret witch had all sorts of horrible implications. As a corrupted holy man, it was assumed that he must be behind the whole witchcraft conspiracy. Clearly, he had to be the ringleader. The corruption of a minister also suggested that Satan was actively trying to infiltrate the Puritans' holy church. It goes without saying that for many Puritans, this was deeply disturbing. As such, many notable Puritan ministers from around the colony attended his trial, including Cotton Mather. At trial, all the strange rumors about Reverend George Burroughs were put before the court. A few witnesses even accused the twice-widowed Burroughs of murdering his late wives. The always colorful Ann Putnam Jr. testified that when she was being tormented by the specter of Burroughs, his malicious spirit bragged about bewitching his 2 wives to death. In the end, 30 people testified against George Burroughs. He was found guilty, and on August 19th, he was sentenced to hang along with 4 other convicted witches. Among them was John Proctor, the vocal skeptic who was now convicted of witchcraft and set to hang. But at the execution, many people were moved by the dignity and grace demonstrated by the Reverend. Eyewitnesses would remember that before he had the noose placed around his neck, Burroughs climbed a ladder and made an eloquent speech to the gathered crowd, proclaiming his innocence. He then led the crowd in prayer, finishing by making a perfect recitation of the Lord's Prayer. It was believed at the time that a witch would not be able to recite the Lord's Prayer without making a mistake. Burroughs' perfect recitation clearly unsettled a number of people in the crowd. One eyewitness remembered that many people were moved to tears, and some shouted out that the execution should be stopped. But those voices were too few. And besides, the fate of George Burroughs had already been sealed. He and the other convicted witches were hanged, and their bodies were quickly buried in an infamously shallow grave. Now, once again, we've reached a moment where if you were making a movie about this event, this would make for a perfect turning point. In the movies, when someone makes a poignant speech that moves a crowd, that usually breaks the spell or turns the tide. But once again, real life is just not that tidy. While the execution of George Burroughs seemed to resonate when people looked back at the trials, in the moment, his eloquent speech from the gallows really didn't do much to change the momentum of the witchcraft trials. September of 1692 saw the pressing death of Giles Corey and the execution of 8 more convicted witches. The executions also didn't seem to be slowing the rate of the accusations. It didn't seem to matter how many witches were hanged, more were being named daily, with a good number of accusations coming from the newly confessed witches. But in September of 1692, we do start to see a shift in public opinion against the trials. Now, it's important to note that this dissent was coming from a minority, an increasingly vocal minority, but a minority nonetheless. Many believed that the trials needed to continue, as the court was just starting to make some headway against the vast satanic conspiracy enveloping the colony. But the tide was turning, however slowly. Near the end of September, Cotton Mather would write the court clerk that he was, quote, continually beset with all sorts of objections and objectors against the work now being done in Salem, end quote. People were clearly concerned about the direction that the witch trials had taken, and they were bugging Cotton Mather about it. One of these dissenting voices was Cotton Mather's own father, the equally influential Increase Mather. With that in mind, Cotton quickly finished up an account of the trials that was meant to act as a justification for what had been done so far in Salem. This was later published in 1693 as Wonders of the Invisible World, but by the time it was printed, the court of Oyer and Terminer had been officially shuttered. In early October of 1692, a letter criticizing the trials, written by the Harvard College treasurer Thomas Brattle, started to be circulated. Mainly, the letter questioned the court's use of spectral evidence, which he argued could be easily faked or even manipulated by the devil himself. Now, Brattle was careful not to deny the existence of witches or even criticize members of the court. he instead presented an argument based on the precedents of English law that spectral evidence should not be admitted by any serious court. After the final group of executions on September 22nd, the court of Oyer and Terminer went into recess, with the assumptions that things would continue in late October. But during this recess, the governor, William Phips, was convinced that the court of Oyer and Terminer needed to be disbanded. This change of heart seems to have happened quickly, but there are a number of reasons why he may have made this decision when he did. Some historians believe that Thomas Brattle's letter influenced the governor. So too may have the opinions of ministers like Increase Mather, who generally supported prosecuting witches, but believed that spectral evidence should not be used in the court. The colony had been in a state of crisis since Phips took office in May. The court that he thought was supposed to solve the problem seemed to be making it worse. Finally, it seems relevant to point out that in late September, William Phips' wife, Mary Spencer Hall, was accused of witchcraft and arrested. For whatever reason, historians are often hesitant to argue that Phips shuttered the court of Oyer and Terminer because his wife was accused. Now, to be sure, there were many factors that influenced his decision, but it seems like his wife being accused probably moved the needle a little bit, right? If he wasn't already convinced that the rounds of accusation had gotten out of control, that probably did it. So it was decreed by the governor on October 29th, 1692, that all arrests associated with witchcraft accusations were to stop immediately. He also decreed that the court of Oyer and Terminer would be dissolved. Now, this didn't quite end the Salem witch trials. You see, everyone in Massachusetts broadly agreed that witches needed to get justice. It was the operation of the court that was concerning. With things paused, the Massachusetts legislature was finally able to set up their new legal system in accordance with the Charter of 1691. All remaining witchcraft cases would be handled by the new Superior Court of Judicature in Boston. Further, going forward, spectral evidence would no longer be accepted in court. On January 3rd, this court got down to trying 52 outstanding cases of witchcraft. But with spectral evidence off the table, most of them were dismissed or resulted in quick acquittals. Of the 52 people tried by this court, only 3 were convicted, and none were executed. On top of that, in this new climate, many of the people who had confessed to witchcraft a few months earlier started recanting their confessions. In May of 1693, Governor Phips finally received approval from the English government to formally close down the trials. He also issued a proclamation declaring that all accused people were pardoned, and those awaiting trial were granted amnesty. However, prisoners were still on the hook for their jailer's bill. Turns out you had to pay for the privilege of staying in a filthy jail in Massachusetts at that time. Many who could not afford to pay the bill remained incarcerated as debtors. This is exactly what happened to Tituba. Amazingly, she had survived the whole ordeal and lived long enough to see amnesty granted, at which point she recanted every piece of her wild confession. The Reverend Samuel Parris, though, was in no mood to pay her substantial jailer's bill. And so she was sold yet again to a Massachusetts merchant, at which point she disappears from the historical record. A full calendar year after the court of Oyer and Terminer first convened, the whole affair had finally concluded. The second round of trials, the amnesty for prisoners, and the governor's pardons had many realizing that the Salem trials had gone wrong. Most still believed that witches had been active in Salem, but many had come around to the idea that the court had acted inappropriately by admitting spectral evidence and that innocent people may have been wrongfully convicted. Many concluded that Satan had indeed been at work in Salem. However, he had deceived people in a way that they had not expected. They had been so focused on the witches, they hadn't considered that the devil may have been deceiving the accusers. It can be hard to offer a post-mortem of the Salem witch crisis because, like many panics, it feels more like a natural disaster than a human event. Like a tornado, there were observable conditions that made it possible, and a path for it to travel was suggested by the environment where it formed. But once it touched down, it was swirling, chaotic, and destructive. Then the conditions changed, and the whirlwind abated. To me, the biggest myth about the Salem witch trials is the idea that they can be explained by any one thing. Anytime you see an article titled something like, "Did blank cause the Salem witch trials?" you should be suspicious. It's an event that refuses to be simplified, so be skeptical of anyone trying to simplify it. A strange series of psychological occurrences created a situation where the shrewd could settle some scores and the powerless could finally taste power. But the chaos and fear unleashed by this sent people into survival mode. The people of Massachusetts started doing whatever they deemed necessary to make it through the crisis alive, be it confess, accuse others, or cheer on the work of a court that was executing witches. When I look at historical events like this, I sometimes wonder what I would have done if I was living in Salem in 1692. Would I have become a witch hunter? Would I have criticized the witch hunt and potentially been accused of witchcraft for my troubles? Would I have stood aloof and watched it happen, saying nothing? It's likely I would have convinced myself of some position that seemed like a reasonable compromise. I believe spectral evidence is acceptable. However, the touch test is far too easily abused. I am a very reasonable man. Or would I have been crushed slowly with heavy stones while I looked hard in the eyes of the sheriff and said, "More weight"? Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore another historical myth. I hope you enjoyed that 3-parter on Salem. Before we go this week, I want to remind everyone that I'm going to be speaking this Saturday, that is if you're listening to this right when it comes out, November 4th at the Intelligent Speech Conference. Go to intelligentspeechonline.com, put in promo code FAKE to get 10% off your tickets. And also go and check out the new t-shirt designs at the TeePublic store. That's tpublic.com/stores/our-fake-history. Or if that's too complicated, just go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the link. Before we go this week, as always, I need to give a shout out to a few special people. Big ups to Adrian Dameron, to Mark, to Emma, to Daniela Smith-Fernandez, to BRD Patriot, to Bert, to Andrew Eisenberg, to Jesse Phillips, to David, to Sarah Dungeville, to Steve White, and to Rob Rombouts. All of these people have decided to pledge $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you to everyone supporting at all levels.
If you want to get in on Patreon, then please go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and select the level of support that works for you. And don't forget to vote on what you want the next extra episode to be on. If you want to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook at facebook.com/OurFakeHistory. You can find me on Instagram at OurFakeHistory. You can find me on Twitter at OurFakeHistory. And you can find me on TikTok at OurFakeHistory. Also, don't forget about the Our Fake History YouTube channel. I know, there's just a ton of stuff now. Anyway, search for Our Fake History on YouTube and start watching those digital shorts. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
The news. It's always happening.
And then afterward, there's always some more of it. Wild how that works. I'm Cody Johnston.
And I'm Katie Stoll, and we are the hosts of Some More News and Even More News, the very first podcasts anyone has ever made about the news.
Every Wednesday on Some More News, we do a deep dive into a major news topic like corporate lobbying, why housing is so expensive, or Elon Musk's many, many insecurities.
And then on Fridays, we're back for Even More News to discuss the most infuriating, bizarre, and bizarrely infuriating news of the week.
Check out Some More News at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or the other ones, wherever you get your podcasts.